I'm here today with Ollie from JTV. We've been meaning to catch up for quite some time, Ollie. I think it's maybe been a year on the cards.
Something like that. Something like that.
And those that don't know, Ollie has a fantastic channel. First and foremost, head over to their JTV. They produce incredible content. One of the things that I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on, to somebody who's been kind of at the coalface, campaigning against anti-Semitism. So I guess that maybe the first segue into that space would be to really ask you where you believe that the greatest threats the Jews face today come from. Is it the far left? Is it the far right? Is it radical Islam? So just to get an overview to begin with of your perception.
The first thing I'd say is that I feel like people, if you're on the right or a conservative, you often doubt. Some people, they're a bit blind, or they'll downplay the far right's anti-Semitism because that makes them feel uncomfortable or whatever. And then on the left, I think there's often a tendency sometimes to be more blind to the threat of the far left. So I think that's just an important bias we have to recognise from the start. I think I don't think it's so helpful to rank them, because they're each playing out in significant ways in different parts of the world and at different times in the last, let's say, 10, 20 years. When you think about something like 9/11 or terrorism, 9/11 was, bin Laden actually said, was largely motivated by America's support for Israel, and there's a reason why he targeted New York, which has such a high Jewish population. But then there are other times where, in the UK, for example, we've dealt with the threat of having a far-left anti-Semitic Prime Minister, Jeremy Corbyn. And that's part of the reason why we focused on a lot of that on JTV. Ultimately, we're a global channel, but we are based in the UK. And so we felt we had a duty to talk about some of these things. And I don't know whether maybe some of your viewers saw our groundbreaking interview with Shami Chakrabarti, where our presenter Alan Mendoza basically was the first person really to prod her and ask her, have you been offered anything in return for this whitewash report that Jeremy Corbyn asked you to do into anti-Semitism, where, by the way, the first thing that you did in order to be objective was to join the Labour Party. How that makes you objective as opposed to subjective and have an interest in it, I don't understand. But anyway, after that point, she suddenly came under huge scrutiny, I think has damaged in the long term her credibility, really. So we're quite proud of being able to do that. I've felt quite passionately that JTV should be fighting anti-Semitism, wherever we find it, and not be overtly party political or anything like that. There have been incidents of far-right violence towards Jews. Just think about the synagogue. There's been several synagogue shootings in America recently, and the rise of what's known as the alt-right in America, which is still considered unacceptable. And I think there is a difference in terms of the acceptability of the difference between far left and far right anti-Semitism. You're more likely to see far left anti-Semitism appear on the New York Times than you are to see far right anti-Semitism appear on Fox News. So in that sense, there's a bit more of a cultural acceptance for the far left, because we see the far left as, for some reason, less scary, and associate the horrors of Nazism with the far right. But yeah, it does seem to be something that's growing that we need to be wary of. But I certainly think that the most important thing that's given Jews stability after the Holocaust has been a sense of, I'm talking about aside from spiritual concepts and all that kind of stuff, just in terms of pure physical safety, has been, I think, two important things. Number one, having a Jewish state, and number two, having the knowledge that Western leaders support that Jewish state. And so that's why I think the threat of the far left is in some ways more alarming, because they seem to be to me, more focused on the far-right anti-Semitism is a more of a classical anti-Semitism. It's more easy to spot. It's more culturally unacceptable, at least right now. And it's less obsessed with Israel and more obsessed with getting rid of Jews from Western countries. Whereas far-left anti-Semitism has a veneer of caring for the underdog and being moral and all that kind of stuff. But actually, it's much more focused on undermining those two pillars of what's given Jewish people stability or a sense of security over the last 70 years. And this is one of the things that I said prior to the general election in the UK in 2019, a few months ago. I said that I think that Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister would see one of the greatest downturns in terms of Jewish safety and security, world safety, since the Holocaust, because it would change that paradigm of Israel's security being seen as, just acknowledged and supported by all the main Western powers, and I would see that as a real big paradigm shift, and that's what troubled me, and I am troubled by, of course, also is the radical Islam poses big threats to Israel's security and Jewish people's security. But I suppose what worries me most, and I think this actually ties into what animates me as a person, which is that I get excited by looking at something which seems to be obviously true and obvious and moral, but then actually digging a bit deeper and thinking, actually, no, that's not quite true. That's not quite the case. And I think what worries me, for example, my religion, I think on the surface, it seems like I don't see a God, I don't see anything. And then what excites me is saying, actually, look a bit deeper, look at the remarkable story of Jewish history, look at some, the depth of our Torah, whatever, and find spirituality there. Dig a bit deeper and you'll find truth. What scares me about what the far left are doing is they're just very, very surface level. They can present quite an easy case of we're the nice guys, we're supporting the underdog, and unless people really dig deeper to see the larger landscape of what's going on, then you're in trouble. And I feel like that's what makes the far left anti-Semitism a bit more sinister.
I think that's really interesting what you say, and tying far left anti-Semitism and the threat it poses to Israel, and Israel being the sense of security that Jews around the world have. We have a comfort that there's a certain comfort knowing that if another Hitler were to arise, we have a place of refuge we can flee to. And that place of
Which
refuge
is amazing.
It's phenomenal, and that refuge
it's amazing. And the fact that any Jew knows they can get a passport to another country, that is unbelievable. And if nothing else, my Zionism is based on that kind of gratitude. Recognizing that, and the fact that Israel will come to people's rescue. I mean, it's not even in extreme circumstances. Look what they did, where they sent planes recently to South America to take back some Israelis stranded in South America due to the coronavirus lockdown.
Yeah, I mean, it goes beyond that. So if you're looking for a refuge, Israel took in 1 million refugees from the Arab, almost 1 million refugees, hundreds of thousands of refugees from the Arab world, Jewish refugees who faced huge persecution. The Jews of Nazi Europe had nowhere to flee, and so many of us were slaughtered. But that wasn't the case. Israel did save the Jews who were facing horrific levels of persecution in the Arab world. And I want to explore that idea about digging deeper, and I think tying that threat of Western leaders no longer supporting Israel if a far left anti-Israel, arguably anti-Semitic government or governments were to come into power. I don't know how you feel, but I think there's very few left-wing leaders, Corbyn, Sanders, whoever, who would actually launch any physical attack on Israel. And therefore, the existential threat that the Jewish state would face wouldn't be coming necessarily from those far left anti-Semites, but from another group of people, and so I'm trying to understand what is the greater threat still. Is it? Because for me, I look at Corbyn and I see an existential threat to the Jewish community here, but I don't see the wholesale slaughter of Anglo Jewry. I don't see.
No.
I don't see.
No, that's not what the far left threat is, though. Well, I mean, it could potentially lead to that. It could enable that, which actually, the only time that I felt scared to wear my kippah since when I started wearing a kippah at age 18, as in wearing it full time, was in 2014 when Israel, engaged in a defensive war in Gaza, and you had the far left rallying up, and it wasn't just the far left, but people rallying up, vitriol, hatred towards Israel, and so we saw it slipping into anti-Semitism.
So this is what really interests me. So I put a poll out on the Israel advocacy movement, asking for people to say what they sense. This is definitely not a scientific survey. It was my audience that's usually biased. It wasn't a representative sample of Anglo Jewry or global Jewry. But I put a poll out asking who poses the greatest threat to European and American Jews, the far left, the far right, or radical Islam. The overwhelming winner, like by far, I can't remember the exact numbers, but the majority of people voted far left. Then radical Islam, and then the far right. I then did a debate with a neo-Nazi called Mark Collett. He's got one of the largest followings in the UK as far as Nazis go. What I witnessed when I did that debate was the most ferocious and violent verbal anti-Semitism I'd experienced in any live stream debate, anything I'd done. My channel is if anyone heads over to the Israel Advocacy Movement YouTube channel, you will see any video is just swarmed with anti-Semites, Nazis, radical Islam. I'd experienced nothing like the visceral hatred of these people, and it made me step back and realize actually it wasn't the far left that are going into synagogues and gunning people down in Belgium or France. It wasn't the far left that were going into synagogues in Pittsburgh. It's far right and radical Islam, and it's that area I want to explore. Is the far left as great a threat as many of us that campaign against the anti-Semitism of the left? Is it as great as other forms of anti-Semitism, violent anti-Semitism?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I want to emphasise, as I say, I'm not trying to rank those three. I'm not giving a ranking. I'm saying in some circumstances, in some parts of the world, it seems one is higher than the other at different times. I think they're all different threats at different times and different circumstances, at least over the last decade or so. Certainly before that as well. But if we're just talking about contemporary era, but an important distinction I think we need to make is that more sort of blatant and violent anti-Semitism versus more subtle policies and beliefs that lead to things which are anti-Semitic. Just because one is more violent and more blatant, that doesn't make it more damaging necessarily. Just because you're a big kicker and screamer, that doesn't make you more dangerous necessarily as someone else, because people might not listen to you as much. And as I was saying before, there's more of a cultural acceptability towards far left anti-Semitism than there is towards far right at the moment. As I say, far left anti-Semitism can appear in the New York Times, far right anti-Semitism can't appear on Fox News. But a second point that I'd make is that I think that saying that I think that first of all I'd like to say this before I get to the main point I want to make, which is that people often ask me, do you think Jeremy Corbyn, a far left radical, is anti-Semitic in his heart? And I think clearly when you're talking about these far right neo-Nazis, it's clear that's in their heart they don't like Jews. They say it. Whereas far left anti-Semites or anti-Zionists, they probably wouldn't say I don't like Jews, at least not overtly. It did happen to be there were some instances where Corbyn seemed to be supporting some sort of more old-fashioned far-right style anti-Semitism, like that mural that he was saying shouldn't be taken down. But in general, yes, you're right. It could be that maybe in their heart they don't think they're anti-Semitic. It may well be that's true, but in politics, what matters much more than intentions and what's in your heart is results and actions. We have to separate intentions and actions. Sometimes an intention might not be anti-Semitic, even though I'm skeptical about that, but its action could have an anti-Semitic consequence. And you say, well, I'm not so worried about what's the far left going to do. Let's say they all got into power. Israel will be fine. Well, would Israel be fine? What if they all they put severe economic sanctions on Israel? What if they give lots and lots of funding to Palestinian organizations, which gets into the hands of terrorists? And what if they, I could even imagine a scenario, let's say you have Prime Minister Jeremy Corbyn, in which he sends Royal Navy ships to accompany a flotilla to go into Gaza and try and break the blockade. And then what happens if Israel confronts the Royal Navy? Then it's not inconceivable that you could even start a war. Whether the Royal Navy would actually listen to the orders of Jeremy Corbyn is another matter. But I think that's an important point to bear in mind, that there could be serious security threats that result from Israel losing support from the big powers, especially the Western powers. But also, I think the other point to bear in mind is that what Corbyn says and the things he supports, as I said when I spoke about being scared to be openly Jewish in 2014, is that his vitriol, his language, his policies enable and empower and legitimize a whole stream of more classical anti-Semitism, whether it's the far right, whether it's just far left, blatant, open anti-Semites, or whether it's radical Islamists. And I think this is, by the way, this emphasizes the importance of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, because it's recognizing that the far left anti-Semitism, it's much more subtle to be able to pinpoint and say why this is anti-Semitic. And so that's why we need to make it clear that this is a very different type of far left anti-Semitism. There's a different type of anti-Semitism. It's an anti-Semitism against the nation state of the Jewish people, and you need to be clear in how you can identify that. And I encourage people to look at the IHRA definition, because it's so important in order to be able to understand what is the frame of acceptable debate and when does it fall into something that's not acceptable and becomes prejudice against the Jewish people.
So I think one of the things that so I have a lot of interaction with various communities, from the ordinary British Muslim to the extremist who's fought in Syria, from ordinary people, ordinary working British people, through to neo-Nazis and extremists. Same on the left. I come from a classically left-wing family. My bookshelves are filled with left-wing thinkers. I was raised with Marx and Engels.
Yeah, same. No, I'm kidding.
We can get to that in a bit. And so one of the things I've experienced is the anti-Semitism coming from the Muslim community and the far left community, or the left in general, is very similar. In that if you speak to the average British Muslim, they will go to great lengths to explain how Islam reveres and respects the Jewish tradition and the Jewish people, and there's many proofs they can point to in their texts, in the Quran and the Hadith. Similarly, if you speak to someone on the left, they will go, I genuinely think if Jeremy Corbyn saw a neo-Nazi attacking a Hasidic Jew, he would run in there headfirst to protect the Hasidic Jew.
I hope so.
And so what you have is two communities that see themselves as friends of the Jews, And then when anti-Semitism surfaces within these communities, not always, but usually within, in my experience, there's this distinction where they say, well, look, my religion teaches me to love Jews. My ideology, my socialism, my egalitarianism teaches me to love Jews. I just have a problem with Zionism. And I love Jews. I just hate Israelis. I love, and I think this is, whereas with the far right, they're much more simple. It's they don't like Jews. And so it makes it much easier to deal with someone who just tells you that they don't like you, to somebody who thinks that they like you, but are also harboring views which are very dangerous to you and are completely oblivious to the fact that they are anti-Semitic. Most the far left anti-Semites I experience believe they are lifelong campaigners against anti-Semitism and that they don't have an anti-Semitic bone in their body. Yet they're coming out with classic anti-Semitic tropes, and the left has always had classic anti-Semitic tropes, whether it's Proudhon writing that the Jews need to be exterminated 100 years before the Holocaust, or Marx writing on the Jewish question that what is the religion of the Jews? Usury. And what is their God, or who is their God? Money. Anti-Semitism has been there from the start, but there's also been this sense of internationalism, brotherhood, equality amongst men, and therefore this blind belief that it's almost impossible to be racist and on the left, which is just absurd and untrue. And I think this, for me, it was one of the things that you touched on. It's very easy to deal with far-right anti-Semitism because they wear their heart on the sleeve. They don't like us. But with radical Islamic anti-Semitism or with far-left anti-Semitism, often those that are espousing those views sincerely believe that they're also our friends. So yeah, I just thought it was really interesting what you were saying, and it kind of aligns with something I believe I've experienced.
And I think, as I say, it's certainly more complex when it comes to radical Islam and far left anti-Semitism. Some of them clearly hate Jews in their hearts. Others, it's more. You're right. It's more subtle. But again, I keep pointing back to actions. And actually, for those who really think about it, they can't ignore the certain reason, the basic sort of building blocks of Zionism and why it happened and why Jews felt it so necessary. And yes, it's difficult for them. They have other issues they're grappling with. But to ultimately understand, if they really are coming to terms with the full history of the Jewish people and understanding what's happened, and they still want to annihilate the Jewish state rather than reach some kind of compromise, when you really learn the history, ultimately, yes, they're grappling with other issues as well, the Palestinians, all that kind of stuff, but life is about choices, and some things aren't completely black and white. And yes, it's much easier when it is black and white. And, I take it as a badge of honor, in a sense, that our enemies 2,000 years ago were the Romans and the Babylonians. They were idol worshippers. These were people who believed in many gods. They were pagans. And today, these extremists that we're dealing with are idealists and want a utopian world and want to look after the weak and the needy. And the radical Muslims, at least, are ethical. They're monotheists. And in a sense, it shows how far we've come. But also it means that as you start to deal with an anti-Semitism which isn't based on Jews being racially inferior or Jews just having the wrong religion, but actually it's about something more. They have to use the language that they use is more. It's more. It has to be smarter, basically, and. Rabbi Sachs talks about how the highest value in society at the time is used to justify anti-Semitism. So in the Middle Ages it was religion, and in the early 20th century it was science and racial theory, all that kind of stuff. And now the highest value in society is like human rights. And that's being used now, and it's like anti-Semites have been presented with the perfect opportunity now, because they can build this case and story of how Israel is now like they're the modern Nazi, they're the dominant, they're the Goliath, and they're persecuting the David. So it's definitely more subtle, it's more complex than old-fashioned Nazi-style far-right anti-Semitism, but it doesn't mean that therefore it's okay. It doesn't mean that it's not a threat, and it doesn't mean that we should just sort of say, well, you're therefore completely off the hook because you have your other concerns as well. Okay, it's a bit more complex what's happened in the case of Israel's story, but if they're still having that level of vitriol against Israel, wanting to completely wipe it off the face of the earth, something just doesn't quite sit right with me to say that there's no... There's something... To say, oh, would Jeremy Corbyn save a Hasidic Jew that was being threatened by a far-right activist? Okay, maybe he would. But there's still something not quite right there in terms of his extremism in opposition to Jewish self-determination. And the other thing I'd say also in terms of far leftist anti-Semitism is there could also be an element to which the far left are quite sort of secular at the moment. A lot of them are. Some of them aren't, but a lot of them are. And maybe there could be an element of opposition to Jewish values that could play a role, which they might associate more with conservatism and that kind of thing. So, I don't know, it's just something else just to throw into the mix.
I wouldn't go that far. What I said is, and it kind of ties into another area I'd like to explore, it's not Jewish values, because these same activists will have absolutely no issue at all getting into bed with Islamists that would execute members of the LGBT community.
Yes, although I don't think they're doing that because of... it's sort of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. I don't think they're doing that because of a buy-in into Islam necessarily. They're doing it because their whole worldview is based around the sort of intersectionality of like supporting the victims, and they perceive the Muslims as the victims, and therefore they have to side with them. Precisely. And they'll put aside their other values for that sake.
And that's the real issue. The issue with Jews isn't their conservative values. The issue with Jews is that they are racist themselves, and they perceive Jews to be white and rich, which is not true. Yeah. I mean, the majority of Israelis come from the Middle East. Yeah. I mean, they descend from while they were in exile, they were living in Middle Eastern lands. They weren't living in Europe. But
it's a bit of a blurry line, isn't it? Because the Western world teaches us that, white privilege, patriarchal stuff, all that kind of stuff is associated with Judeo-Christian values in a sense. So it all gets a little bit blurry. But I take the point.
Yeah, but the other area I'd really like to explore is why. Why does the far left have such a problem with Israel, and why do many on the far left then, as a consequence, have such a problem with the Jewish people?
Well, there's several ways to tackle this. There's a theological and spiritual way that I would instinctively tackle it, which I'll get to in a second. But just from a purely just empirical understanding their worldview perspective, I would say that it's because, as I say, it's exactly what you said. Their entire, the modern far left's worldview, it sort of sometimes is referred to as like the whole kind of wokeism, which basically looks at the world through only one moral prism whatsoever, which is how much are you a victim? And the more you're a victim, the more right you are. And so Jews, they see as very high, or I don't know whether you call it high or low on the victim scale, not much of a victim, which, by the way, is so deeply perverse. I can't even go there. Yes, it's true that a lot of Jews today are, they're in a proportionally to everyone else, they're in a decent and good socio-economic position. But, this is part of the whole stupidity of their whole worldview. It's like you've been persecuted and downtrodden and despised and alienated and put to one side throughout the majority of your history, and now you're finally starting to do well. Well, now we hate you. Like, it's like, well, why are you trying to help victims if they and make them lose their get rid of their victim status, shed their victim status, if the second that they do that, they suddenly become the enemy? It's
precisely the 100%. Like the hope. I think about the Jewish people should be a symbol of hope. Zionism should be an inspiration to all oppressed people. But what happens was, the minute you liberate yourself, the minute you overcome those that try to destroy you, suddenly you're perceived as powerful, and therefore you're suddenly discarded and seen as evil. Could not agree more with what you're saying.
And Zionism is, in my mind, one of the greatest human rights projects in history. And it's so true, and I think that's part of where it comes from. They see the Jews and the Zionists as the European white colonizers, which is so ridiculous, given that so many Jewish Israelis are from Arab countries, actually. And the Palestinians are the indigenous, which is not the case actually. The Jews are the indigenous people. Not to say that there's not a question of peace plan and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to get into that, and they, not to say they don't have any right to their land. I'm not going to get into that as well. But just in terms of the fact that Jews are indigenous to the land, and that just their whole worldview, and they're saying, and the Palestinians have the moral high ground entirely because they're the victim, and therefore they'll somehow morally equivocate Hamas with Israel and all that kind of stuff. I think that's partly what's going on. I think another part, which touches what we were saying earlier about values mismatch, is that Zionism, and this actually touches on all kinds of issues around nationalism versus globalism and Brexit and all these things. The left lean more towards universalism, and the right lean more towards particularism, and Judaism has always been about a synthesis of the two. It's been about Judaism has been throughout its history having particularist methods to achieve universalist aims, and I think they don't like the particularism of a Jewish nation state. That's a big difficulty for them. They want everyone equal and the same in all senses, and sometimes that verges into equality of outcome, which the communists and radical socialists pursue, which leads to terrible tyranny as a result when they try to achieve those aims. But I think the big fundamental thing they're missing in their whole desire for universalism at all costs without a balance of particularism is they don't realise that actually love is particular and meaning and identity has to be particular. As Rabbi Sachs puts it, he calls it the dignity of difference. You know, if we're all the same, we have nothing unique to contribute to the world. If we're all unique and different, if we have our own different families, identities, nations, cultures, backgrounds, all that kind of stuff, while still potentially having similar values, if we have different things to contribute to the world, then we can get our sense of meaning and uniqueness and identity from that. And I think that's one part that they're missing as well. But in terms of the spiritual perspective and the way that I look at it, you're saying the question was, I think you were talking about, you were asking about what's really the most dangerous threat, and why is it that this has happened? Why is it the far left hate Jews? Not all the far left, although it seems to be that some of the things they're doing anti-Semitic. From my perspective, actually, from a theological perspective, is that one of the great things about Zionism is that it led to Jewish self-empowerment. But one of the, I don't want to say downsides, but one consequence of that is that it could lead to Jews feeling a sense of, well, we don't need God anymore, basically. We don't need, it's the IDF that will protect us all the way. And of course, we believe in the importance of doing our bit and putting in our effort, and we can't just leave things to open miracles and God and all that kind of thing. But I do think,
to watch the last 30 minutes of this video, head over to our Patreon, where you can listen to Ollie's thoughts on religion and Zionism. Patreon's a place where people like you power the Israel advocacy movement. We don't have any big backers, and we depend on small Patreons and people purchasing merch like this Zionist hoodie. So make sure you head over to either our shop or to the Patreon to help us. It really makes a difference. If you can't, then simply share this video or follow us on all of our social media. And whatever you do, make sure that you head over to JTV on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram and subscribe to their social media too. You won't regret it. They produce fantastic content. Thanks for watching.